In a small wooden cabin nestled deep within the forest, life for Eleanor and her ailing father, Harold, was a constant struggle. Their home, a single-room structure, was filled with the smell of damp wood and herbs used in feeble attempts to manage Harold's worsening condition. Eleanor, only 17, bore the weight of their survival on her slender shoulders, scavenging for food and tending to her father as best as she could. One spring morning, as the sunlight pierced through the cracks in the cabin walls, Eleanor adjusted the blanket over her father's frail frame. His breathing was shallow, and his once strong voice had faded into whispers. "Ellie, don't go too far," Harold rasped weakly as she grabbed her basket and knife to forage in the woods. "I'll be careful, Papa," Eleanor assured him, planting a kiss on his forehead. "I'll find something to help." The forest greeted her with a cool breeze and the sound of birds faintly calling overhead. Eleanor followed a narrow path, her boots crunching softly on the damp ground. Her eyes scanned for mushrooms, wild onions, or berries, but the forest offered little after a harsh winter. As she ventured deeper, the trees grew denser, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. She whispered a quiet prayer, her breath forming faint clouds in the chilly air. "Please, just something, anything." Suddenly, a low groan broke the silence. Eleanor froze, clutching her knife tightly. The sound came again, a pained cry, faint but unmistakable. Her heart pounded as she scanned the shadows between the trees. Against her better judgment, she stepped forward, her curiosity outweighing her fear. Rounding a moss-covered boulder, Eleanor gasped. There, slumped against the roots of a massive oak, was a man. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, his face pale and streaked with dirt. His leg was caught in a rusted bear trap, blood staining his trousers and pooling on the forest floor. "Help," he rasped, his voice barely audible. Eleanor hesitated, her instincts screaming to run. But the sight of his pained expression struck a chord in her. She couldn't leave him. "Hold on," she said firmly, kneeling beside him. Her hands trembled as she worked to pry open the trap, the metal teeth biting into her palms. The man groaned in agony, his breath shallow. After what felt like an eternity, the trap released its hold. Eleanor quickly fashioned a makeshift tourniquet from her shawl, tying it tightly around his injured leg. "I'll take you to my cabin," she said, her voice steady despite her racing thoughts. The journey back was grueling. The man, though lean, was heavy, and Eleanor's small frame struggled under his weight. Her arms ached, her legs buckled, but she refused to stop. Every groan he let out spurred her onward. Finally, the cabin came into view. "Papa!" Eleanor called as she stumbled through the door, dragging the man behind her. Harold stirred weakly, his eyes widening at the sight. Who is this?" he asked, his voice laced with worry. "He's hurt," Eleanor replied, laying the man on the floor near the fire. "I found him in the woods. We have to help him." Harold's brow furrowed, but he nodded. "Be careful, Ellie." Eleanor worked quickly, cleaning the wound with water and binding it with strips of cloth. The man remained unconscious, his breathing shallow but steady. "Who is he?" Harold asked softly. "I don't know," Eleanor admitted, glancing at the stranger. His clothing, though torn and bloodied, was fine, too fine for a common woodsman. A gold watch glinted on his wrist, smeared with dirt. The hours passed in tense silence. As night fell, the stranger stirred, his eyelids fluttering open. Where am I?" he croaked. "You're safe," Eleanor said gently, kneeling beside him. "I brought you to my cabin. You were caught in a trap." He nodded faintly, his gaze shifting between Eleanor and Harold. "Thank you," he whispered. "What's your name?" Harold asked. "Walter." "Walter Bennett," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor and Harold exchanged glances. The name sounded familiar, but they couldn't place it. Walter's eyes fluttered shut again, his exhaustion pulling him into a restless sleep. Over the next few days, Eleanor tended to Walter, feeding him broth and changing his bandages. Harold, though skeptical at first, warmed to the stranger. Walter's strength began to return, and with it, his gratitude. "I owe you both my life," he said one morning, his voice stronger. "I'll never forget your kindness." Eleanor smiled faintly. "We couldn't leave you out there." As Walter recovered, he began to share bits of his story. He was a wealthy businessman from the city, disillusioned with his life and seeking solace in the wilderness. But his escape had gone horribly wrong, leaving him stranded and injured. "I was foolish," he admitted. "Running from my problems instead of facing them." Eleanor listened intently, her own struggles mirrored in his words. Despite their differences, they shared an unspoken understanding of hardship and resilience. When Walter was well enough to stand, he made a promise. "Eleanor, Harold, I will repay your kindness. You saved my life, and I intend to change yours." Eleanor shook her head. "We didn't do it for a reward." "I know," Walter replied, his gaze steady. "But you deserve one." A week later, a carriage arrived at the cabin, its polished frame gleaming in the sunlight. Walter stepped out, leaning on a cane, and gestured for Eleanor and Harold to follow. "Where are we going?" Eleanor asked, her heart pounding. "To a new beginning," Walter said with a smile. The carriage took them to Walter's estate, a sprawling mansion surrounded by lush gardens. Eleanor and Harold stared in awe, their humble lives in the forest a stark contrast to the grandeur before them. "This is your home now," Walter said, his voice warm. "No more struggling, no more pain. Here, you can heal and thrive." Tears filled Eleanor's eyes as she looked at her father. Harold, once frail and hopeless, stood taller than she'd seen in years. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. Walter placed a hand on her shoulder. "No, thank you. You showed me the true meaning of kindness. Now it's my turn to do the same." As the days turned into weeks, Eleanor and Harold settled into their new lives. Harold's health improved with proper care, and Eleanor discovered a love for learning, spending hours in the estate's vast library. The bond between them and Walter grew stronger, forged in the fire of shared struggles and unwavering kindness. And as Eleanor stood in the garden one evening, watching the sun set over their new home, she knew that their lives had been forever changed, not by wealth, but by the courage to care for a stranger in need. As Eleanor stood in the garden, surrounded by warmth and hope, she realized how far she and her father had come. From struggle and despair to a life filled with kindness and opportunity, her courage to help a stranger had transformed their lives. Walter's words echoed, "Your kindness saved me, now it's my turn to save you." This story teaches us that even the smallest act of compassion can spark profound change. Eleanor's bravery reminds us that we all have the power to make a difference when we choose kindness over fear. What does this story inspire in you? Reflect on how a single moment of courage could change a life. Share your thoughts or similar experiences in the comments, we'd love to hear your story. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us in spreading hope and inspiration through powerful stories like this one. Together, we can be the change the world needs.